Good afternoon, friends. Good morning to my friends in Alaska and Hawaii. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. And I want to give a special thanks as we get started to my friends and colleagues here at Cadre who have helped to put this webinar together and promote it and are providing the fabulous technical support for all of you as we go through. As was mentioned, we're happy to tackle questions as we go. I've got quite a bit of content for you related to the DRK-12 program, Discovery Research PreK-12. If you have questions, I encourage you to put them in the Q&A box. I'm happy to address them as we go, either with content that we've already got prepared, or I've got a couple of moments where we'll take a bit of a pause for additional questions. So with that, we've got an action-packed hour in front of us, and I'm going to just go ahead and get us started. Discovery Research PreK-12 Program, the current solicitation is NSF 20-572. You might either notice from having submitted before or infer from those first two digits, it is the same solicitation as last year. So if you've looked over that solicitation for the previous competition, nothing has changed in that solicitation. I'll talk about what we changed going into that solicitation a little bit as we go. But the big mission of DRK-12 is really to enhance STEM learning in formal pre-K-12 settings, students and teachers, through research and development of STEM education innovations and approaches. One big change we have made, and you see it on the left panel there, you're going to hear me say it a few times today, and I can't emphasize it enough. Proposals this year need to be submitted either through research.gov or grants.gov. You may notice one of our typical submission vectors, FastLane, is no longer on that list. FastLane proposals will not be accepted for the DRK-12 competition. So a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. I've got some general NSF policies and procedures I'll talk about. I'll dive into DRK-12 as a program, talk about the program expectations, give some thoughts about proposal preparation and the review process. And then just some general information and some final questions. As I mentioned, between many of those pieces, we'll pause to take some questions, and you can put them in the Q&A box at any time. So speaking about some NSF general policies and procedures, the Proposal and Awards Policies and Procedures Guide, or the PAPG as we affectionately refer to it at NSF, is your comprehensive guide for submitting any proposal to the National Science Foundation. It's generally updated annually. We actually skipped 21 because of the pandemic, so the current PAPG that's effective is 20-1, but you notice the text I have in red there. NSF 22-1, which is already up and available on NSF's website in draft form, will become effective on October 4th, 2021, which conveniently is 2 days before the DRK-12 proposal deadline. So if you're submitting for that deadline, you need to be aware of some of the new requirements in 22-1. There's not much that's changed for most grant submissions. There's a lot of clarification in there, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we go. As always, if there's a question about what's in the solicitation and what's in the PAPG, the solicitation is always a more specific version of what we're looking for a particular program. So if there are places that conflict or that are unclear, the solicitation always wins, it always supersedes the Proposal and Awards Policies and Procedures Guide. And as always, if you have a question about that, we encourage you to reach out, and we'll give you contact information for the best ways to do that at the end of the broadcast today. So how to submit, as I mentioned, and again, you'll hear me say this more than a few times, DRK-12 now requires the use of research.gov or grants.gov. We will not be accepting submissions through FastLane going forward. NSF as a funding agency is field driven, and we talk about this all the time, and let me tell you why that's important. Oftentimes, as a program officer, as the program lead for DRK-12, people come to me and say, well, what are you really interested in seeing? And the answer to that is, what are you really interested in doing? We are driven by the field. We have some structures in place that kind of are the guardrails for our solicitations. We have some things that sometimes we issue through Dear Colleague letters, or saying we're particularly interested in a few focal areas, but we're driven by the field. We fund STEM education in any area of science or engineering that's supported by the agency. As program officers or program directors, we use those two terms fairly interchangeably. We're part of the decision-making process. So we can only give you limited feedback as you're preparing a proposal. We're happy to do that. We're happy to look at 1 to 2 page drafts of proposal ideas. But we're not going to say, well, you should really do this project. We're interested in the project that you want to do and the fit that it has between your idea and our solicitations, and in this case, particularly DRK-12. You'll see this slide a couple of times as we go. This gives an overview of the proposal review process and the timeline. And I won't hit every single box on there, but I'll call attention to a few things on this screen. The preparation from when the deadline is for submission, in this case, October 6, 2021 for ours, we've usually got about 90 days between when an opportunity is formally announced. You've already got the DRK-12 opportunity out there, so you already have more than those 90 days to go about doing that work. Then once those proposals come in, it's about a 6 to 9 month process. You notice that bar in blue at the bottom for proposals to be reviewed. And we'll talk a little bit about what that review process is like for program officers, then to huddle up and make our recommendations as a program. And then those recommendations, of course, go through several steps. If a panel likes a proposal and thinks it's highly competitive, that's only the first step. It then goes through work with across program officers within a solicitation within a program. It then goes to the division director for concurrence with that recommendation. And then all of that is still advisory to the Division of Grants and Agreements that looks at all the fiscal details. And all of those are places where you can make a recommendation ultimately leading to award. That review process in the Division of Grants and Agreements, even when it leaves our hands as program officers, is usually about 30 days as well. So that gives you a sense of the timeline. We promise we're not just holding on to a proposal just to make you sit and sweat a little bit. We're always going through a process of engaging with those reviews, of looking at the portfolio balance, of taking a look at what we're going to fund and what our priorities are as an organization. So that's generally when you can expect to hear the results of a review, anytime between 6 months and about 9 months from that October for us solicitation deadline. Another question we get often, who's eligible? So any organization is eligible to apply. Awards are to organizations, not individuals. So you have to apply through your organization. Your organization has to be registered in the sam.gov system. You need to do that if you haven't applied before, if you're an educational nonprofit or a startup or a new entity, you're going to want to get on that registration in the SAM system because it can take several weeks to be able to process. If you come to me a couple of days before the submission and say, oh, I didn't know I had to have a SAM number, can you help me out? My answer is usually no, it's out of my hands. If you are a new organization, you also have to demonstrate that you have acceptable accounting mechanisms in place to be recommended for the custody of federal tax dollars, a federally awarded grant. There are a number of resources for you that outline those requirements and give you some guidance for what those reviews look like. So if that applies to you, I'd encourage you to grab the PDF version of these slides after we're done that our friends at Cadre have, and poke into a few of those links to get some more information about the new awardee requirements and what those reviews are. But any for-profit, nonprofit, educational institution, university, K-12, district, in general, you're all eligible to apply. The PAPG is noted on the title of that slide in Chapter 1, has some specific details on that if you're looking for some more information. There are also these things that we call DCLs, cleverly for Dear Colleague letters, that you'll see pop up now and again. And I just want to clarify these for a moment. These are not new funding opportunities. They kind of are designed to call the field's attention to some aspects of existing funding opportunities that'll accept proposals in a particular area. So I've given an example here of a Dear Colleague letter that's actually active right now, which is the Advancing Quantum Education and Workforce Development, NSF 21-033. So this Dear Colleague letter, as you might infer from the title, is talking about quantum computing and quantum education, and it checks a number of our solicitations that accept proposals related to quantum education. DRK-12 is one of them, but there are many others that are named in that Dear Colleague letter. So those are ways of just flagging our attention to a particular area that we'd like to see some proposals come into us across various programs. There are some other programs in the Division of Research on Learning that I'll call your attention to just briefly. If you're finding that your proposal is not a particularly strong fit in DRK-12, there are a number of other opportunities that you can engage in. I mentioned that DRK-12 is focused on formal classroom-based education. If your interest is more in the informal space, that first program listed there, ACEL, Advancing Informal STEM Learning, is really the program for you. There are our sibling in informal education. EHR Core Research looks at basic research. iTest talks about innovative technology experiences, innovative new technology, and innovative uses of technologies, both for students and teachers. One of our oldest programs, I think it turns 20 this year, if I'm remembering correctly. Computer Science for All, again, close kinship to DRK-12, but really looking at computer science education as a focus. If you've been familiar with our cyber learning program in the past, that's been renamed and reconstituted to that second to last bullet, REDL, Research on Emerging Technologies for Teaching and Learning. And there's a great new program that we announced just a few weeks ago, Racial Equity in STEM Education, or EHR Racial Equity. I'd encourage you to take a look at those if those are of interest to you. I'll just bounce right off of that since our focus today is on DRK-12. And as always, if you have a question about where your idea fits, reach out to us. And we're happy to give you some perspectives. Even if you send something to us at DRK-12 and say, I think this is a fit for DRK-12, but I'm not sure, and we think it's a fit for somewhere else, we'll let you know, and we'll hand you off to some folks who can continue that guidance for you in another program. So as I mentioned, the goal of the DRK-12 program is really to catalyze research and development of STEM education. DRK-12 is an applied research and development program. So you have to be developing an educational innovation of some sort. It can be work with students. It can be work with teachers on teacher preparation or teacher professional development. It can be a combination of those two. It can be developing curricular materials and looking at what the implementation of those looks like and the impact on student learning. All of those are fair game. So that's the development piece, but there has to be a rigorous educational research piece with it. I would love to say you can come to us and say, we're interested in funding this really interesting curriculum. Can you give us a couple of $1 million to write that curriculum? And I'll say, if you've got an educational research component, if you're going to study the implementation of that curriculum, if you study what teachers learn from implementing that curriculum, then we can talk. If it's just straight ahead development, it's got to be both to fit into the DRK-12 program. That's the way the program is written. And again, the other real distinguishing feature of DRK-12 is that it focuses on formal STEM education infrastructure. So schools, districts, teachers, states, regions, in formal education settings. DRK-12 is actually our largest program in the Division of Research on Learning. We have about an annual funding rate of about $90 million. Not all of that goes to new awards. Some of that's, of course, awards that are continuing. But we tend to make between 40 and 60 new awards a year across a number of funding levels. And you might say, well, Mike, what are those awards? And I'll tell you where you can find that information. You can find information about DRK-12 funded projects, titles and abstracts. They give you a sense of what's fundable, what those outcomes are at the DRK-12 webpage, and you see the link there that takes you right into the DRK-12 main landing page. This will both show you ongoing projects that we funded and are going on right now, and prior projects that that have been completed in the past. Our partners at Cadre, at our resource center for DRK-12, cadrek12.org, also have information about many projects, both current and past, and some additional information on there. On the DRK-12 website here at NSF, you'll find our titles and abstracts, and any publications related to awards that have been made, active or prior. Cadre, you'll find some more materials from existing projects, and you got links to both of those pages. Thank you, in the chat for all of you. So the current solicitation, NSF 20-572, just noting is the same as last year. The submission deadline, we moved it up last year from November to October, and we're keeping that. It's going to be generally that first Wednesday in October going forward, at least for the next few years. And that falls this year on October 6th. And as you might have heard, you're only able to submit proposals through research.gov or grants.gov this year. No more fast lane. Hold your applause on that till the end. I want to go a little bit into the anatomy of the DRK-12 program. It's one of our broadest programs since it's one of our largest. So there are a lot of moving parts here, and I want to spend a few moments talking about these. And if you have particular questions about these categories, this is a great time to put these into the Q&A, and I'm happy to pause for a moment here and make sure they're addressed. There are three different strands that we talk about in DRK-12: assessment, teaching, and learning. And assessment can be about student assessment, can be about teacher assessment, can be about the development of those assessments. So one of the questions we got prior to this webinar is, does DRK-12 fund psychometric and measurement-oriented projects? If they have a formal STEM classroom education focus, absolutely, that falls into the assessment strand. I should note, I'm a former DRK-12 awardee myself before I stepped into my role as a program officer. So I've been on both sides of this. And one of the things that I know I struggle with as someone who does work in teacher education and teacher professional development are the other two strands actually there, teaching and learning. Like those sometimes are hard to untangle. It's like, do I submit to teaching? Do I submit to the learning strand? And my advice is always to think about what's foregrounded. So for example, a lot of my work is on teacher professional learning. We might be implementing a new curricular, innovation, or working on some teaching practices. And I care about the learning side. I care about what students are learning in those mathematics classes. And maybe I'm measuring that too as a part of my project. But if teaching is more the foreground of the work, then that's the strand to submit to. If it's more about the student learning side, and teachers are going to learn something about implementing this along the way, but I'm less interested in studying in detail their learning outcomes, then I'm probably going to move towards the learning strand. So I always think about it as what's foregrounded and what's backgrounded. So that's one way to untangle those. Teaching and learning in particular can be really complicated to untangle. And again, if you have questions about it, send us a note about your particular idea and we're happy to weigh in. Project type. These are independent of the strand. You can combine those strands with any of these project types. I want to talk about the first four. The fifth and sixth are a little bit different, and I'll mention those in a moment. The project types range anywhere from exploratory, which means you're kind of testing out a new idea, you're doing some theory building, you're thinking about taking an idea and kind of a proof of concept sort of study. That would be more that exploratory flavor. Design and development, and that's the bulk of the proposals that historically we receive are in the design and development category, is you're building something and testing it out, a curriculum, a student learning intervention, a teacher learning intervention. So you're designing it, you're testing it out, you're studying the outcomes. And we've got both early and late stage. I'm going to there are a lot of questions about that typically, and dive more into that as we go. Impact and implementation and improvement are both kind of aspects of if we're thinking about scaling up innovations, and there's slightly different flavors. I'd encourage you, if your interest lies in this idea of scaling up or this idea of capacity building, and I see that question noted in the Q&A, take a look at the impact and the implementation and improvement categories. Impact is really looking at aspects of going to scale in kind of that more traditional scaling up sense, like kind of more numbers, more districts, more students, more teachers. Implementation improvement, I think, is the hidden gem in our solicitation, honestly, because it takes a look at, maybe we're not trying to scale up huge, but we're looking at what are the contextual conditions. Let's zoom in really closely on thinking about how to bring an idea into a new setting, and what are the conditions, what are the factors. Let's say I'm putting a curricular intervention into a district. What are the conditions under which that thrives? What are the conditions under which that are challenging? Let's do a real deep dive into what you need to effectively implement and then ultimately scale that work up down the road. And I think it's a really, really interesting category. If you're having difficulty about determining whether or not a project is exploratory or design and development, you can always let us know. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I do a little bit of a dive into design and development. So stay tuned for a little bit more on that. Synthesis are research syntheses or meta-analyses. We're really interested in funding these. We don't get a lot in any given year, but we're really interested in providing the field with the opportunity to fund some work to do that. And of course, conference are convenings, and these still have to be, both of those still have to be research and development. A synthesis really does feel like it's research. A conference, you might think about, okay, kind of what's the research aspect of this? What's the data collection to be in a conference to tell that it was an effective convening? We love to get people together and talk about important ideas in the field, but we do want to think about what's the broader impact between, beyond just the 45 people that we managed to gather in a room to talk about some particular idea. Funding level you see on the right, we have level 1, 2, and 3. They have dollar amounts and number of years related to them. Synthesis and conference have their own categories there. You see I matched those in color, but the 3 green ones there, I want to emphasize, those are mix and match with your project type and your strand. So a lot of people ask me, am I supposed to read across this? You're not. You can mix and match and do what's appropriate for the work that you're asking to do. And I'll talk a little bit about that more when we talk about budget. So those are all entirely mix and match. You could submit a teaching strand exploratory project at level 3 for $5 million and 5 years. That'd be a heck of an exploration. So that may not be the best match. Usually our exploratories come in level 1, maybe level 2. Usually our impact studies come in level 2 or level 3. So you can see some associations there, but you can mix and match these in whatever way makes sense for the project that you'd like to propose. I'm going to talk a little bit about some highlights, some things that we modified in the last solicitation. If you were at the webinar for the last solicitation, I apologize, you're going to have seen this before. But if you haven't, some of this is going to be new. And we did get a number of questions that I think are addressed by some of these. So from the prior solicitation, we made some clarifications. The design development expectations, the impact project type, I'll talk about those in a bit. Commitment, interest, focal areas. The revision note in the solicitation indicates there's an emphasis on supporting early childhood and computer science. And a lot of people say, does this mean that that's all you're taking? No. And computational thinking along with that. All it means is that it's updated to really emphasize our commitment to supporting those areas as a part of the larger STEM ecosystem, just to make sure that it's really clear that we are interested in stuff on early childhood STEM, that we are interested in stuff on computer science, because I know some of our computer science programs have kind of come and gone, like STEM plus C, we kind of folded into the work of DRK-12. So just signaling that is an avenue available to you if that's work you're interested in doing. We also upped the synthesis proposal limit in both dollar amounts and years. So a little bit about design and development here. So some of the things we did with design and development, and we always get a ton of questions about this. the goals that we had, we talked about, and this actually will help that question that came in about the contrast between exploratory and design and development. For the goals that you're really about, it's really about providing this compelling rationale that specifies the problem, justifies its importance, talks about how your idea will differ from existing practice and why those ideas are going to lead to some improvements in what area you're looking at. The theory should have a strong theoretical and empirical justification for the work, provide a compelling rationale, and a well-explicated theory of change or logic model. So if your theory of change is a little squishy, you're still trying to develop that as a part of your work, that's probably more of an exploratory project. If you've got a strong theory of change or a logic model, then that's something that probably is for design development. I see a question coming in. Do we support replication and or reproducibility studies? Yes, the common guidelines between NSF and IES actually outline, and there was an addendum that we completed to that a few years ago, outline what standards we're looking for in replication or reproducibility. So we'll refer you to that document for further detail about that. A couple of other ideas in terms of design and development. In particular, we get a lot of questions about should I do early stage, should I do late stage? If you've got something that's an early version or prototype, then you're probably a late stage. If you're developing that, then you're probably an early stage. And late stage proposals, usually where appropriate, they should provide some estimates of the effect size by the time the project is completed. So there are a couple of really key distinguishing features between early stage work and late stage work. In terms of methods, the methods in a design development project should include methods for developing the innovation to the point where it can be used. Like the idea of a design development project, at some point you're going to hand that off and scale it up. You're going to talk about impact. So really setting the stage and the methods that you've put forward to really be able to do that work. Should be about collecting evidence related to feasibility and pilot data on the promise for achieving that expected outcome. Mentioned we did some work on impact studies and synthesis projects. So we were more detailed about submitting impact projects. Impact studies expand the evidence of promise from previous studies to provide more rigorous evidence of the strength of a STEM education innovation or an approach to achieve its intended outcomes. This is accomplished through efficacy or effectiveness studies, and the solicitation goes on to talk about the distinction we see between the efficacy and effectiveness studies, but either of those have a home under impact. The proposals for those impact studies should provide a clear description of the innovation or approach that's being tested. They should provide a compelling rationale for examining the impact. Again, a detailed theory of change and describing how that theory influences selection of the variables that you're going to study in the impact work. And this supports presenting clear research questions to be answered. It should describe and document what the existing evidence is that supports the innovation, and then what you're looking at. It should go beyond pre-post data, should include evidence from experimental or modern quasi-experimental designs. Qualitative designs also welcome under that umbrella as well. I'll refer you to some additional details if you're interested in impact studies that you can find in that solicitation. In terms of synthesis proposals, we were also more detailed about the expectations for synthesis proposals. So I'd really encourage you to read that carefully. We're really keen on seeing contemporary research methods that you're going to use for synthesis or meta-analysis. We've got some details on that in the solicitation. And we've got the links to the common guidelines and the companion document on replication and reproducibility in the chat for you. I want to talk a little bit, I referenced change models. I want to share some that are less good in particular ways. So sometimes you might see a change model like this if we're talking about a theory of change or a logic model. This one to me is kind of the wrong grain size. So for a program like DRK-12, this is really looking at everything under the sun: effective STEM education and quality STEM teachers and equity and communities of practice. It's way too much for a single DRK-12 project. So you'd want to have a change model that's a little bit more dialed in this one, or that specifies what aspects of this you are looking at in your particular project. Let's go a little bit in the other direction though. Here's one that is dialed in, that is particular, but maybe is overly simplistic. So it looks, let's say we're looking at professional development related to pedagogical content knowledge and fractions, that we're interested in developing teachers' pedagogical content knowledge and looking at fractions instruction, and students' learning of fractions. Those are all great things. That's dialed in way more tightly than the previous one that I mentioned, but it's still overly simplistic. We want some detail within each of those categories about what you're looking at, what your theory of change, like what's going on in those errors. How do you see those mechanics being unpacked? What does the PD look like? What's the frequency? What's the duration? How is it going to be delivered? And how is all that supported by literature? How are those constructs being operationalized? So the proposal really should be clear with respect to that iteration and development. If it's a design and development project and there aren't any observable changes in teacher knowledge or instruction, then it's probably time to rethink the professional development. So the change model really could be more detailed with respect to how those feedback loops play into the design of a project. Couple things, and I've mentioned these a little bit already, and then we're going to pause for questions for a few moments. So areas of particular interest for funding, you note that we called some of those out in the proposals. Those aren't limiting. We'll certainly consider projects across the STEM education ecosystem. They're just calling out particular areas that we want to make sure that the field knows that that are available to you to submit to DRK-12. So the projects involving those areas should still hew to the core DRK-12 mission. So they still should be related to formal education. And again, if you're wondering about the fit of your specific idea, please reach out and chat with us, and we'll have some contact information about that at the end. I'm going to take a moment for questions. I've got a few queued up in the Q&A that I'm going to share and answer. If you've got some more coming in, I'm happy to tackle them. Some of these I may hold because I've got content related to them later on. So somebody asked if I could provide a change model example for student learning. I don't have one at the ready, but again, I would look at those as examples out of grain size. If you have a project that you're interested in learning more about that we funded in DRK-12, I can't send it to you. But you can always reach out to the PI on that particular project and ask if they're willing to share their proposal with you. We're not allowed to share them publicly. I've got a couple of questions about likelihood of getting funded. So does asking for a higher level reduce the chances that your proposal will be funded? Are multi-institution proposals more likely to get funded? No. I'm going to talk about the review criteria in a moment, but the NSF review criteria is dictated by the National Science Board are the intellectual merit of the project and broader impacts. You'll notice as we unpack that, there's nothing in there about favoring or penalizing multi-institution proposals. There's nothing about favoring or penalizing funding levels. I will say with respect to funding levels that your funding level should match the scope of the project that you're proposing. If reviewers are taking a look at a project and you're asking for $5 million and the reviewers are really saying, well, I'm not sure how this is 5 years of work and $5 million worth of work, then that's probably going to be a challenge for a proposal like that. So your narrative should match the scope of the funding that you're asking for, and that justification really should be clear to reviewers. But we don't have bins that we put those in and say we're going to fund X number of these small dollar amount proposals and Y number of these large dollar amount proposals. Did I say there was a focus on early learning in CS and CT? Kind of. Early childhood STEM education is a focus area for us, and computer science and computational thinking are focal areas as well. So if you're doing something that lives at the intersection of those, cool. We are happy to see it. I've got some questions here that I'll tackle a little bit down the road. One that I will add in now: can an informal education setting that works with school districts to provide teacher PDM programs apply for funding for such a partnership? Maybe. So really, if you're working across that formal informal divide, and that's fine to do, you may be trying to figure out, does it fit better in DRK-12? Does it fit better in advancing informal STEM learning? Your best bet is to reach out to us, tell us a little bit about your project, and we're happy to provide some guidance on that. So we don't draw hard lines and say, if you're doing a DRK-12 project, you can't do anything in the informal space. No, but the emphasis should be on the formal STEM space, and there can be some connections to informal STEM. If the emphasis is more on informal and there's connections to formal, then probably ASIL is the right vector for you. Somebody's asking about good or important attributes of an assessment proposal. It's good science. And I can't speak to specifics about that. We'll talk a little bit about intellectual merit and broader impacts in just a bit. But a good assessment proposal, if it's good science, if it answers good questions in STEM education, then it's a good DRK-12 proposal. So again, a little bit about proposal preparation. I've mentioned the solicitation. I'll draw your attention to section 5 in that solicitation that talks about proposal and submission instructions. And it's been edited. The one edit we made from last year's proposal, we kept the number the same, is again, research.gov are the only places you can submit. NSF 20-1, the PAPG, the current PAPG is in effect before October 4th, 2021. 22-1 is in effect on or after October 4th, 2021. I'll talk about a couple of the important changes on that in just a moment. It's coming, I promise. In your project summary, which is the one-page sheet, and if you want to send us an idea in advance, this is a good format to use to send us kind of a one-page idea before you submit. That first sentence should tell us the type of study: exploratory, design, development, early or late, impact. Those are all the categories. Tell us the main strand that you're addressing. In that second sentence, make sure you're checking the STEM discipline, the grade or age level addressed. This helps us get the proposal to the right set of reviewers who have expertise in your area. So we're not just being picky about this. This is really helpful to us to communicate where you're situating your idea so that we put it in the hands of reviewers that are the most likely to really give it the best possible chance in the competition. The project summary should address intellectual merit and broader impacts. I'll unpack what we mean by each of those, and they must include separate statements on each of those 2 National Science Board criteria. If your project summary doesn't have these things in it, your proposal may get returned without review. And that makes us sad, and that makes you sad, and we don't want anybody to be sad. So please do these things. Another place where we get lots of questions is in, you might call this evaluation, you might call it advisory board. In the solicitation, we talk about this as mechanisms to assess the success of a project. So any proposal has to have appropriate project-specific external review and feedback processes. This is not your research questions. Your research questions are what you want to study and the data you want to collect. The mechanisms to assess the success of the project are an external evaluator or an advisory board or a combination of the 2 that look into your work and say, is your project accomplishing the goals that you want it to accomplish? It's really good to have a specific set of questions that guide those mechanisms to assess success, that would guide your evaluator or guide your advisory board. This external critical review should be sufficiently independent and rigorous. Don't find somebody that's at your institution or your organization unless you get a really, really fabulous reason to do that. Make it external to the work. Successful proposals that we see describe the expertise of those external reviewers, explain how that expertise relates to the goals of the proposal, and specifies how the PI is going to report and use the results of those external critical review processes. So again, getting at that idea of that feedback loop. Supplementary documents, another thing we get a lot of questions about. Brief letters of collaboration. take a look at the advice that the Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide has on what those letters of collaboration should say. There is recommended, not required, but recommended language in there. There's some very good reasons to use that language. Anything that looks like an endorsement of the work risks your proposal being returned without review. It should have a list of personnel that's on the proposal. You must have a data management plan and a postdoctoral mentoring plan if you have a postdoc on there. No other documents. You can't submit a logic model here. It's got to be in your 15 pages. You can't submit additional attachments. You can't send us out to a website that you'd like us to look at. All of that's not allowable under the solicitation. It's that 15-page project description, your budget justification, these supplemental documents, and a little bit on personnel, and that's it. Somebody asked in the run-up to the webinar about COVID-19 contingency plans. Are they still needed in the 15 pages? They never were. So if we have a proposal that's a candidate for funding and we're engaging with you and asking about IRB clearances and asking some clarifying questions about a proposal, and we are still in a pandemic situation at that point in our funding cycle, we will ask, and if you've been awarded already in the last couple of cycles, you know this, we'll ask for a short one-page COVID contingency plan that lives outside of your project narrative. If it makes sense to say a few things about how you might adjust for the pandemic in your project narrative, I'm not going to stop you. Go ahead and do that. But we will ask you for that detail if we continue to be in a situation where we're going to need that if you're a candidate for funding. So that's later on in the game. We always get a ton of questions about budget. And I will say, I'm going to make a pitch for Cadre right here because they have some tremendous budget support tools and recordings of webinars discussing good budgeting and both pre and post award. So really go there, knock yourself out. They've got more than you're ever going to need on budget. Your institutions are also really helpful here as well. But just a couple of notes on this. It should be consistent with the level of the work, and you don't have to request the maximum. If you're trying to pad your budget out, guess what? Reviewers are going to see that. And you want them talking about the substance of your proposal. You don't want them spending the limited time they have to talk about your proposal, talking about aspects of the budget and being nitpicky about that. So write a budget that makes sense. Write a budget that's consistent with the level of the work. The famous NSF 2-month salary rule is the 2-month salary rule. No more than 2 months of salary for senior personnel on all NSF grants unless justified. There's some folklore out there that this may only apply to folks in academic institutions, in tenure track appointments. That's not the way the PAPG reads. Now, clearly, if your work is subsidized, if your research is subsidized the way tenure track appointments are, that's a different set of considerations than somebody who is working in a soft money position or an educational nonprofit. So that is a consideration we will make, but it doesn't exempt you from, if you ask for more than 2 months of salary across all funded NSF projects, you either have to tell us how you're going to reduce effort if all those projects are funded, or you have to justify why you need to ask for the waiver of that rule. And that has to be done in the budget justification. The PAPG, both the current and the pending one, 22.1, include new guidance on the format for Biosketch and current and pending support. We did that last cycle. It hit right at the start for us. So there were a couple bumps in the road with some of those formats. So I'd encourage you to look at those if you haven't submitted in the last couple of cycles. If you don't use those templates, we're going to return it without review. And I wish I could get around that, but those are the rules. One new thing in 22-1, biosketches can now be 3 pages instead of 2. Got a question, can a course bio be considered in addition to 2 months salary? No, that counts for your salary. So if you're buying out of your time and you're putting that in there, you need to give a month equivalent to that. Usually in most places that's about an 1/8. I know that's the way my university plays it. So that's, 1.125 months right there, depending on how that's scheduled, anywhere between that and 2. If your university says a course buyout is more than 2 months, then you're automatically going to exceed that rule if you ask for 2 months. So you're going to have to justify that in your budget. A couple more financial things. Can a sub-awardee for a nonprofit organization with a main awardee be a higher ed institution? Yes. And if you haven't applied for funding and you don't want to go through that review process, being a sub-awardee and using a university that's already been through that review process as the lead can make things easier in terms of that financial review. So a couple more things, and then we're going to pause for some more questions. Reasons for return without review. I won't read the whole list here, but you're going to see some things in here. One question we've got is, how much of a change do you need? Well, I wish there were a clear answer, but we do look at previous submissions for similarity. If all you've done and you had a proposal that was reviewed okay, but not great, and all you did was kind of go through and change the years and iterate things, that's probably going to be one that will return without review, because what we're looking for is to see that you've addressed you've addressed what the considerations were in a previously submitted proposal. All proposals review fresh with review panels, and that's really important. But if it's too similar, if you just took the same thing and kind of iterated the date and you didn't attend to the reviews, that's probably a case where we're going to send it back. If you didn't address intellectual merit and broader impact on the project summary, if there are extra documents, if it's something that you've already got in under consideration for another program at NSF, we can't look, and it's not been completed, the review's still pending, we can't look at it in DRK-12. So that's another, we get a handful of those every year that we have to return because it's already being looked at in another program, and we can't look at it in ours. Proposals are reviewed in panels that are composed of external experts, so educational researchers, content experts, teachers, developers. If you're interested in reviewing, always let us know. And I mentioned the NSF review criteria of intellectual merit and broader impacts. So those are the criteria. And we have this set of 5 considerations that we ask our reviewers to think about for both criteria. What's the potential to advance knowledge, benefit society? There's a question about sustainability, kind of what are our standards for that? This is what we're looking at in broader impacts. If the project really, if the project really just is localized, and most of the projects we get more great projects than we're able to fund. So if the project is fabulous, but it's not clear how it's going to make a broader impact beyond the teachers and the students that are served by that project, then that's not going to really rate well with reviewers on broader impact. So really thinking about where can the work travel? How does it benefit society? How does it advance outcomes in the field? What's the originality, the creativity, the potentially transformative concepts? Is the plan for carrying out those activities well-reasoned, well-organized? Is it sound? Like, is it good science? This is the is it good science question, right? How well qualified is the team to do what they're saying they can do? And are there adequate resources that are available to the PI and the co-PIs and the collaborators to carry out those activities? So those really are the elements. If you really don't see it here, it's not something that enters into the conversation. And that's an important piece. I'm going to bring this slide back here because it feels like it's the right time to do that, to talk about that process. So as I mentioned, we convene panels that take a look at those proposals and provide their external review for us. And you see that kind of in those brackets in the middle of that diagram there. Most commonly, this is panel, but sometimes there are combinations between those. And that's the first pass. You notice NSF Program Officer, hey, that's me. Just to the left of that, our role is to convene those panels and put the proposals in front of them that match their area of expertise. You notice to the right of that is where Program Officer analysis and recommendations. I don't even get to have a say until the panel has their say. So if they like something, that's great. Now I can take a look at it and give my input. If they're not keen on it, there's not a lot I can actually do. So remember, your first audience for this is your peers, are those panel reviewers who are the experts in the field. And then from there, as we note, it goes through those additional steps, those bits of fiscal review. So for further information, you can call us. That line you see rings to a variety of people. And again, as in many situations, we are still a bit spread out in pandemic mode. So if you don't immediately get someone picking up that phone, that just goes to a voicemail, and we are happy to call you back. In fact, the voicemail sometimes is easier because I can make sure it gets directed to the person who's got the expertise to call you. There's an email address. Yeah, you might contact a DRK-12 program director, and we used to have a list of these on our webpage. We've gone away from that. Let me tell you a little bit why. You might think, oh, that's just some impersonal email. Who knows where that goes? I'll tell you where that goes. It goes to me. There are a couple of people that have access to that inbox, but it comes to me. And the reason we do this is because it makes all of our lives easier. Like, you don't have to worry about which program officer has expertise in like elementary math education or in engineering education. Don't worry about doing that work. Send your idea to DRK-12 at nsf.gov. I'll take a look at that. I'll either respond to you personally if I've got the chops to be able to do it, or if it's a technical question, or I'll forward that to a program officer who's got the expertise to take a look at your proposal and your idea and be able to provide some feedback. And so we're happy to be in contact with you about that. Our turnaround time is actually quite remarkable. I check that email address multiple times a day, every day when I'm on duty, and if I'm not, somebody else is. And we're usually able to get a program officer back with you within a matter of days to provide you with some answers about your ideas. So that's the end of my spiel and the start of questions. We've got a few queued up that I'm going to start with. If you have additional questions, now is the time to bring them in. Tracy Higgins asks, for the 2-month salary limit, was working in a nonprofit, wanting to work for full-time, a legit justification for asking for more than 2 months of salary. Necessary but not sufficient, I might say, putting my mathematical hat on. You have to justify why that time is necessary to do the work. So in that budget justification, tell us about the work that you're doing in your particular context. Tell us about what's subsidized and what's not subsidized, and why it's going to take that amount of time that you're putting in there to be able to do the work. I know those estimates are sometimes hard to make. Like I get my time estimates wrong on a daily basis about how long it's going to take me to do things, but try to lay out a really good case. If you're particularly, if you're asking for something that's in excess of 2 months, make a good case for why you need that time that connects to the work that you're proposing to do. Some sub-awardee questions. Do sub-awardees not go through the financial review? The primary awardee goes through that full financial review because they actually have custody of the sub-award. NSF doesn't get into the weeds with sub-awardees about the jurisdictions of those awards. All that is the responsibility legally of the lead institution. Is it allowed for sub-awardees to have more of the funding than the prime awardee? Yeah, there's nothing that prohibits that. But again, you're going to want to work that out with a primary awardee because they're going to be the ones that are fiscally responsible for the entire award from soup to nuts. Hi, Keith. Keith asks, is there a mechanism or desire for communicating the substantive changes that have been made to a revised proposal? That's a great question. NSF doesn't have a revise and resubmit. Everything is treated as new. So you don't have to have a cover letter that talks about what's been addressed. In fact, I would say that's going to be distracting to reviewers. Make a case in the narrative that you look at, that you provide to us for how you've addressed the concerns of those reviewers. And if it's a proposal that's been previously reviewed, I'd encourage you to reach out to the program officer as you're putting that new work together. Talk about how you're thinking about making those changes. Program officers do have access to kind of the history of those proposals. So if we need to make a call about whether something is sufficiently revised, we can look, but we're judging, your reviewers, remember, are judging off of the narrative that you provide them. So provide them a narrative that's clean, that doesn't look like it's a revise and resubmit. Will the slides from the presentation be available later? Yes, they absolutely will be. My friends at Cadre have them and they are ready to post. In fact, that cues me to go to the next slide that talks about the fact that the slides and recording will be posted. We still have about 4 minutes and 27 seconds left to spend with you today. So if you have additional questions in the Q&A, I'm more than happy to answer them. If you'll excuse me, kind of freshening my throat here to do so. And I'll second the notion that these are great questions. And the ones that you all submitted in advance were fabulous. They helped guide the content of this presentation. So I greatly appreciate your thoughtful questions. Zoom wait time is so weird. I imagine people furiously typing away right now. And as much as I'd love to provide you with some, some thinking and some question writing music, my wife did take the accordion out of my office because I've been using it too much for that purpose. So very sorry, I can't provide you with some musical entertainment. If you wanted to reach out to a program officer who handled your proposal last year, should you start with a general DRK-12 email? Okay, yeah, that's a good question. Start with the program officer who handled it last year because they have access to the reviews. If you're not sure who that was, go into research.gov, take a look at the proposal that was declined in your reviews there, and it identifies who the program officer is. That's the right place to start for a previously submitted proposal. If you got a new idea or just different idea that you'd like to vet, send it to that DRK-12 at NSF.gov address. You'll notice we're doing that actually for many of our programs, and it's the same sort of thing. I promise you, there are real humans and real program officers behind all those email addresses. Oh, great question. If you want to serve as a proposal reviewer, which email should you contact? Send it to that same one. And what you can do is send just an abbreviated 2-page CV. And boy, we love when people volunteer to review. A couple of things about that. If you're submitting for this cycle, you can't review for this cycle for this program. But if you're interested in reviewing for other programs, like if you'd like to do iTest and you're submitting a DRK-12, that's a great idea. And it really gives you insight into the ways in which we do the review process. It allows you to read some really exciting proposals. You can't talk about them outside of the panel discussion, but it gives you some interesting insights and ideas. And we really do have a good time in our panel discussions. It's hard work, but it's really rewarding. So you can send a 2-page CV that shares a little bit about what your area of expertise is to that address. I collect all of those. I send them out to all of our program officers when we're starting to put panels together, so they have all that information available to them. All right, well, the clock on the wall behind me has reached 5 o'clock Eastern time, so I'll address this one last question and then send you off to the rest of your day. If a STEM scholar and a non-STEM scholar with an applied linguist are teaming up, do you prefer the STEM scholar to the PI, or does it matter? It doesn't matter, but it should match the scope of the work you're proposing. So the PI should be the person who's got the most central expertise to what you're proposing to do. So if you have a particular question about that, I'd encourage you to reach out. Hey, thanks for spending an hour with us, folks. Like I said, there are plenty of great additional resources on Cadre's website. I look forward to hearing from you in the email, on the phone, and I'm happy to answer questions you might have. And once again, thanks to our friends at Cadre for putting this work together. Have a lovely rest of your day, and we'll talk to you again soon.